Cool. This is our lecture on flowing and case. So last lecture, we talked about 1AC, 1NC, what to do on case. Now we're going to do the next two speeches, 2AC slash 2NC slash 1NR, the neck block on case. Note that this is case only, so we're talking about, from PF language, the affirmative contentions and the negative rebuttals to those contentions. We are not talking about negative contentions, which is considered off case in policy, or negative strategies like topicality, counterplans, critiques, things like that. Those will all be later lectures we will build into the debate, but we are starting out small and building you in the very basics of debate, which is an aft contention, neg rebuttals to those contentions. So let's go ahead and talk about some background. So first of all is flowing, 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 flowing. And so if you were in middle school intro or middle school PF, you've already figured out at least the columns and you have an idea of acronyms and things like that. Now, if you have no debate experience or formal debate experience and you didn't know what to do and you just put you flow to it looks like argument extensions almost that you wrote, that's okay. I'm not going to take off points for that for this first time. But in the future, we need to kind of get to more of a proper flow, and all that work you did, you can probably just retype for argument extensions anyway. And so it's probably like, two birds, one stone. So this is an example of a flow from policy. So if you Google flows and try to find Google images, I would say like 90% of the images are atrocious in what not to do. Anyone have an idea of why that is? If you just Google debate flow on Google, do you think those debate flows are policy flows? No, you're going to find some random PF Congress flow where the person has just written stuff down that has no organization, schema, and it's just a wrong way to do things. And so this is something that has been internalized. I learned all this when I was very, very young back in the day myself. And so this is an example of a good flow right here. So we'll talk about what some of the key things are. A flow is basically a form of note-taking. And so your goal is to kind of just take notes of what the opponent's saying so you have an organization of what's going on. Why do you do this? Because there are a lot of arguments in debate. And so particularly early on, you might be able to keep some of the arguments in your head, put it in the document, things like that. But for those later last speeches, if you do not have a good organized flow, it becomes an absolute disaster, where teams are just dropping things left and right, there's no organization, and it's not really a resolvable debate. And so having a crystal clean flow is the first step to becoming a good debater. So first question is, how many sheets do you need? There's a very simple math equation to decide that. You count the number of aft contentions, so usually advantages, but there might be solvency and things like that. And then you count the number of negative off-case positions. And they'll usually tell you the number of off-case positions before their speech because that lets you get the number of flows you need. And so, for example, if there are two advantages for the case, which is our current aft structure, and there in the neg has a DA, a counterplan, a critique, two topicalities, and then they read case responses, the case responses go to the advantage. And so we have the two advantages plus the off case, so plus one DA, counterplan K, two T's, add that up together, it's 7, which means the number of sheets of paper you need is 7 sheets of paper. The next thing is, when do you start flowing? Now in PF, it's super important to flow the very first speech in the debate, the constructives. Why? Well, a lot of your teams don't disclose. It's not on the wiki, anything like that, and you need to flow it in order to know what the heck they're saying. Now in policy debate, it's a little bit different. And so here's where it's actually a little bit easier. You have less columns. PF, you have 7 and 6. In policy, you might either have 5 columns or you might have 6 columns. And so basically, we'll talk about the differences in a second. The 1AC, or first speech in the debate on the AF, you do not need to flow. In fact, you should not be flowing. Why? Because in policy debate, both NDCA packet means every single person in the country is reading the exact same AF. So do you need to take notes and figure out what the AF is, or do you already know what it is? Already know what it is. Vice versa, once you get to JV or varsity or a non-NDCA tournament, it might be a lot more AFs, but all of it is already disclosed on the wiki. And if it's not, as soon as you get that pairing 30 minutes before the round, you go to the room, you say, bro, what's the AF? And they send you a copy of the AF. 30 minutes prior. And so you already know what they're saying in that first speech. Do not have to flow it. The negative off case positions also do not need to flow. Now, as an app, you need to kind of pay attention to what's being said so nothing's trickly dropped in there that you're not paying attention. So a lot of you, hidden A spec is the meme for that. That some of you Berkeley kids, I'm sure, experienced firsthand. That hidden arguments on the flow are set that you don't pay attention to. A dropped argument becomes a true arg, and then you lose the debate because of two lines that are basically like, you were the color red, you should lose, right? Silly, but you didn't answer it. So on off case, you are not flowing what they're saying because if you're a 2A, you're preparing your 2AC. You're looking at the doc saying, okay, they read this disad, let's go pull our block, make sure they read all the cards in the speech. So you're somewhat listening while they're going to check for hidden arguments that are snuck in, but you're not necessarily flowing. The first time you start flowing is during the 1NC, 5, 6 minutes in, 4 minutes in sometimes, where they say, now on to case. When they get to reading the rebuttals to their opponent's contentions, no matter what you're doing, you stop and you start flowing case. If you say, oh, I'll figure it out later, what basically happens is you end up wasting 2 times the amount of time later just figuring out the flow. And all that prep times went away, and now you're in trouble. So as soon as they say case, you stop whatever you're doing, whatever you're prepping, you pull out the sheet of paper, and you start flowing case. That's tip number 1. That's why you have that extra column is on case. It starts with the 1NC. On off case, the first column is the 2AC. So you're deleting that first column. And that's how you have an extra column on case. There is no 1AC column, so that's why we're not getting to 7 or 6. The next thing to think about is line by line and organization. This is what makes a good flow from a bad flow. This is primarily where I look at for grading these things. Notice here, a common PF tendency that we saw in class was, or we saw all last year, we have our columns. This is the contention. Now it's rebuttal time. Is the summary shorter or longer than the rebuttal for PF, time-wise? Shorter. And the final focus is even shorter. You see that flow? That's a very common middle school intro flow. It's a very common flow from UPFers last year. None of this is actually organized line by line. You've just kind of just written down, scrunch it all at the top. In policy, you need to be able to identify drops. And so lining the arguments in response to each other, where they line up, super important. Being able to identify where there's a drop that you can circle, extend, also important. And so having that organization is super, super critical to have a good, competent debate by the last few speeches, which means you need plenty of spacing. If I put every single 2AC argument on an off case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the next speech comes up, and they have 3 responses to number 1. And now we're down to number 2. You see how we've gotten a mess? And so if you really just took your sheet of paper and split it, it's much easier to keep everything organized. Next big tip is you want to summarize, not transcribe. So another common mistake is the more words I put, the better my flow is. So I'm just going to listen, and whatever they're saying, I am typing or writing like a maniac as fast as I can what they're saying. Have you internalized that? Do you know what those words mean? No. And so it's better to listen, simplify what they're saying into 2 or 3 words, write that, and then if you have some time because your opponent's rambling, just start writing your answers next to it. Does that make sense to everyone? That's a big difference between being a court reporter, whose job is to sit there and to type word for word what everyone's saying, versus someone who has to give the next speech and debate. And what matters is not what your opponent said, but making sure conceptually you've understood it. So when you get up and indict it, you've gotten it right. After summarizing and transcribing, abbreviations, super important. Symbols, super important. Now, you don't be writing full sentences when you're flowing. There's no need to put the word the, right? You can simplify things. Rather than write the United States federal government, right? You can just write USFG. Other common symbols you might hear, right? You might see things such as link. You can have turns, right? So link, turn, right? You can have internal link. You can have impact. You have uniqueness or non-unique. You can have leads too, right? You have all these things that could be words, and it's up to you to decide what makes sense to you. Circle R, common for Russia. Circle C, what do we think that's common for? China. And so there are some things that you terminologies and concepts you'll see a lot in debates, and you get very easy sort of flowing symbols that you figure out, and it becomes much, much easier. Legibility is important, but for you. You are using your flow to do the next speech. Is the judge after the round going to ask to see your flow? No. Now, your partner might, and if your partner can't read it, there could be some problems. But for the most part, the flow is your own responsibility. It's what you are using for your next speeches. So as long as you can read your handwriting, you're fine. Now, you can't read your own handwriting. You're pulling up the sheet of paper. It's your turn to debate, and you're like, is that a lamb? Is that state? The debate's not going to go so well. And so, for example, my handwriting, is it pretty good? Atrocious. Something that come high school, ninth grade year, I was forced by my English teachers to start writing in all caps because it was illegible otherwise. And so whatever works for you for legibility, you need to have down that you can read. Also, as you see, different colors can be helpful. Usually con is red, neg is red, pro or app could be whatever, black, blue, whatever color you have. That can help you keep you organized on who's saying what. Is it my opponent or me? The next thing to talk about is when to start flowing on laptop. So you're going to see some of the older kids, the varsity kids, they're flowing on a spreadsheet. And everything's super organized. And do you think you write or you type faster? Hopefully at this point, all of you type faster than you write. And if no, you need to sign yourself up for some typing classes. Which means if you can type faster, you can take notes faster of what your opponent's saying and spend even more time writing your responses. So there is an advantage to flowing on a spreadsheet. Does that make sense to everyone? It's also easier for your partner to read, to share. You can share one flow together. There are inherent advantages to being on a spreadsheet. But you cannot start with learning how to flow on a spreadsheet. And those of you that went to camp, they probably beat that into you. Why? Because if you start flowing on a spreadsheet, what ends up happening is you never internalize shortening, simplifying, conceptualizing, abbreviating. What ends up happening is you just type out full sentences what your opponent's saying because you can keep up. And you're typing out full responses of what you're saying because you can keep up. And it becomes very, very inefficient and also not super well organized. How easy is it to draw lines or circle things on a spreadsheet? Not that easy. You have to have other symbols to represent it. And so in this class, everyone is required to flow on paper. First year in debate, you flow on paper. After your first year in debate, once you've internalized how to properly flow, then we can graduate you to flowing on a spreadsheet and teach you how to do it. But if you start with flowing on a spreadsheet first, you are hurting yourself long run, and you end up having debaters, and some of your opponents will do this, where they have that Google Doc or that doc, and they have typed the whole debate in it, and by the end of the debate, half the stuff is dropped. And you'll see those opponents this year. The last thing I'll suggest is practice makes perfect. Flowing is not something you learn to do immediately. It takes lots of practice, lots of watching rounds. Luckily, every round you compete in is an opportunity to flow. Every round you watch of a varsity round that's on YouTube is an opportunity to flow. All of the rounds when we're out there, opportunity to flow. When you're in class taking notes, also sort of an opportunity to flow, right? So you can go through, flow your teacher. It doesn't have to be as super organized as that, but you can work on summarizing, not transcribing. You can work on using symbols, abbreviations, things like that. So that's an example of a good flow, and I'll kind of continue that. Here's one of case debating. And if you note by the handwriting, this is my handwriting. I put one together for y'all. Terrible. But some key things to note about the flow that does make it good. Did I put lots of spacing between arguments? Yeah, that allows me to line everything up well. So I didn't just crunch everything to the top. Usually on a regular sheet of paper, you might get 4 or 5 arguments on a sheet of paper for like main 2AC responses or 1NC responses. And if you run out of space, what do? Flip the page. You got that whole back. In worst case, you can always grab another page if you use all that. If you use a legal paper, which is a little bit longer, as you've all seen, some of the debaters use. We have some reams back there for use for tournaments. But it's a normal page that's maybe a few inches longer. This lets you put an extra argument at the bottom. Better for organizational purposes. Outside of proper spacing, you can see I pretty much summarized arguments that would be said, the 1 or 2 words and a few symbols. Handwriting atrocious, definitely needs some work. But there's a reason why I quickly went to spreadsheet debate flowing. All right, let's now jump into some structure stuff, 2AC, 2NC. First of all, the 2AC generally. So on case and off case combined, you have an 8-minute speech to respond to the 1NC. There's basically like 3 big tips I can give you to have a good 2AC. One is you want to think backwards from the 2AR. If the argument is something you are throwing out there, haven't thought much about, if your opponent puts 4 or 5 responses, you say, crap, I can't go for it. Should this be your only argument on the sheet of paper? Probably not. Should it be your first argument on the sheet of paper? Probably not. The general philosophy is you should be thinking about what the minimum argument I need to win this argument is, what that minimum and best argument is, and it should be your first argument on that sheet of paper. And so you need to have at least one winning complete 2AR strategy set up in the 2AC, because you don't get to make new arguments in the back half of the debate. And so if you never made the argument at the beginning when you had the chance, so sad, too late, didn't make it, maybe next time. Luckily for you, I write all these 2AC blocks, and so you have these arguments in the 2AC for you to learn. But it's important to think about how they operate, how this argument, how your opponent might respond to this argument, and how you would respond to those responses. And if you can conceptually work out that math, you are pretty good for the back half of the debate. Second big suggestion is time management. Very, 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 very common novice mistake is have poor time management. You have 7 sheets of paper to cover, right? If you have an 8-minute speech and you spend all 8 minutes on those first 5 sheets of paper, and you dropped a counterplan and net benefit, or you dropped the topicality argument, is there any chance for you to come back? Not really. There could be a tiny chance, but not much, because a dropped argument is a what? True argument. And so thus, if you do not get to that sheet of paper because you didn't manage your time well, you're in trouble. Your 2AC blocks generally have the best arguments toward the beginning. And there might be a lot of arguments. 8, 9, 10. Do you have to read 8, 9, 10? No. If you have to move on, move on. You might only get the first 4 or 5 and say, fine, I need to move on. Let's move on. The best arguments were first. Or if you see a question mark before a tag, that might indicate it's an optional argument that only if you have time do you need to use. And so having that timer up and thinking before your speech, I want to spend roughly this amount of time here, this amount of time here, this amount of time here, and keeping track with that during the speech is a super important skill for a good 2AC. The last concept to talk about is a concept called 2AC terrorism. Now, probably not the most politically correct word these days, but it's a very good concept that I was taught when I was at camp, and I want to keep going forward with you, and this is just the language of what it is. The concept is as follows, and there's kind of 2 different ways it goes out, the wrong way and the right way. So the wrong way, which is, how a novice or JV person might think about it, or the average National Circuit PF person will think about it, is about having horizontal proliferation or horizontal depth. So all I do is, let's say there's a sheet of paper. This is a DA. They have, let's just say, 4 responses to the DA. I'm a National Circuit PFer. My mindset is, only 4 things to frontline. Bam. 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 So I made my 1 analytic per argument. I got through it super fast. So now I've answered the 4 arguments super quickly. I have plenty of time to go for other strategies. And so you'll see them say, I'm going for everything because I'm only putting 1 response to each, which means the opponent in the 1AR, why this isn't good, all they have to do is they just need 1 argument to beat the sheet of paper. And say they pick the number 3, they extend it. How many things do they have to respond to on the number 3 now? Just 1, right? They only had 1 response. Does that take a lot of time? Is there a lot of depth in that? Is there a lot of thinking? Probably not. And so one big difference between varsity PF and policy, you collapse early and you put a lot of depth in the negative block. And so instead, you'll have something that you have those 4 responses. And instead, the negative, they have long pre-written blocks to these that has a lot of answers to each 2AC argument. Now, if I'm extending number 2, not only do I have to extend it, how many things do I have to respond to? 1, 2, 3. That's 3 times the work. 3 times the opportunity to miss flow and to drop something. And so here, it's super important to do vertical depth and put lots of responses rather than just 1 bad response, move on. Because we all learned in PF when frontlining, it doesn't really matter what you said, it's just the fact you said something. And in policy, that's not the case. It's what you actually said and was it a good argument that matters. So a 2AC terrorist is someone who says, I need to read a ton of responses on off-case positions. Anything that DA counterplan, if I just put 1 response, they're going to put 15 answers. And then my 1AR is going to be like, I hate you, 2A. I have to now answer 15 things if I want to go for the sheet of paper. Whereas if I'm a 2A and I put 8 responses, my opponent might only get 2 or 3 on each one. And then it's a lot easier when I extend number 7 to only have to deal with 1 or 2 responses rather than 6, 7, 8. And so in order to become this, if you have to spend a lot of time on off-case positions, you should not be spending much time on case if you're a 2A. The 1AC already has 8 minutes of cards for your case. Your opponent basically spent 3 minutes answering it. Do you need more cards? No. You already got those 8 minutes. So your job on case is to go through that as fast as possible. If your opponent spends 3 minutes, maybe you're trying to get it done in a minute and a half. So you have more time on the off-case positions where you have no cards to put as many responses as possible. Let's now talk about on-case. So here, we talked about, in order to do 2AC terrorism, you have to be quick and efficient so you have the maximum amount of time on off-case positions. Some basic tips. We talked about how you first have to flow the 1NC on case. As soon as they say on to case, you need to start flowing. If you wait till after to figure it out, you're basically doubling the inefficiency to get prepped, and maybe even worse. Organization, super important. If there are 4 1NC arguments, should I start with the number 4? No. I start with the number 1, and then I do the 2, then I do the 3, then I do the 4. Signposting also important. If you have 2 advantages, you tell the judge, on to advantage 1, Russia. They say this, but. They say this, but. They say this, but. They say this, but. Now on to my China advantage. They say this, but. They say this, but. They say this, but. I've signposted to the judge which sheet of paper I'm on. The next big thing to talk about, a big difference between novice and varsity, is how to respond to the case arguments. So we'll pretend this is case over here. So this is the first 4 arguments in the 1 and C right here. Now it's 2AC time. I have to respond to these. We already talked about I don't need more cards. So the traditional novice way to do it is you see a card, let's say it says no impact. You go find your card in your case that's the opposite. It might say impact. Each of you have already written argument extensions. And so on number 1, they say no impact. I read my arg extension, so I explain my argument that says yes, there's an impact because sentence. And then I do my number 2, which is a card comparison or sort of an argument resolution. Why my card is better, my argument is better than theirs. Note, a lot of these 1C cards are short. And if you are doing this, you have a full argument extension, which is pretty much as long as their card. And then you have to do card comparison and argument resolution afterwards. Is it going to take you more or less time to do the 2AC? More. They just had to read a card. They didn't have to do any card comparison. You had to do an argument extension, which is roughly equal to their card. Then you had to do a card comparison, argument resolution, which took more time. And if you do this, you're spending more time on case, and you have less time on off case. Not good for 2AC terrorism. So the modern suggestion, you do not make argument extensions on case. Come the 1ER, you can do it. It'll be allowed because you had 1EC cards. But on each one, you should be jumping what your card is that answers it and why your card is better. They say there's no Russian war. However, my Johnson 25 card postdates this by 3 years and explains that Ukraine actually leads to a war. Do you see how I've given carded reasons, argument resolution on why my argument is better comparatively? I didn't just say, extend Johnson 99, Russia war is high, here's 5 reasons, A, B, C, D. Now my opponent says this, here's my card comparison, A, B, C, way too long. Balance is important. If their argument is really, really good and threatening, you might have 3 or 4 card comparisons. If it's super good, you might even have to read a card. If their arg is very, very bad, they have a 1-sentence card that says, Putin is dead, written from 4th grader writing a blog. Do you need much of a response to that? Probably not. You could probably just say, turn on the news. Moving on. And so determining threat level depends on how much time you spend on each one. The last big difference for the 2AC is, especially in novice, some of your judges are going to say you have to extend your case up top and weigh it. In PF, in the second rebuttal, do you have to extend your case and weigh it? No, you wait until the next speech to do it. Same thing in policy. You do not have to extend your case and weigh it in the 2AC. You can wait until the 1ER to do that. If there's a particular causation weighing argument you want to make, that can go on an off-case position in the 2AC. But you are not extending your case up top. The first words out of your mouth after saying on the Russia advantage should be, they say blank, but. Does that make sense to everyone? And that gives you more time to spend on off-case positions. All right, 2 last slides. Actually, some common mistakes real quick. Don't do impact cal, just talked about that. Don't extend case at top or bottom. Don't just extend the argument extension and move on. You need to actually resolve the debate and do card comparison. If you have 2 advantages, in the 2AC, you should not really be kicking advantages, and we'll talk about what that means later. Come the 1AR, 2AR, you definitely need to be collapsing onto one advantage. But at the very beginning, it's better not to kick, so your partner in the 1AR can save time and kick them, because they have 5 minutes to answer 13 minutes, so they need more built-in advantages. There's something called add-ons, which are like reading a new advantage in the second speech. Avoid doing them. It usually takes more work than it is worth. Let's talk about 2NC, 1NR and case. So generally, case, off case combined, 2NC, 1NR. First big thing is you want to split the negative block. So the negative speaks twice in a row in the middle of the debate, and then the AF has to answer both of those speeches. 13 minutes versus 5. To make this effective, the first negative goes. The second negative does not stand up and say, I'm going to repeat what my partner said, and then just reread the doc. Is that going to add anything to the debate? No. And so you split the block. You say, hey, I'm going to take A, you take B, and we'll kick out of not go for C. Or in D. You collapse accordingly. So you might start out with like 6 strategies to win the debate in the 1NC. By the negative block, you're going for like 2, 3, or 4. And then by the 2NR, you're picking that one strategy to sort of ride or die on. We talked about having vertical pressure on the 1AR. Lots of responses on each 2AC argument are the key to win debates. One blippy response on each 2AC argument doesn't really scare a 1AR. And it's very easy to prep and for them to get up and just read. 2NC is generally going to take case arguments. And so you're responsible for being able to know how to say why other cases are wrong and to explain rebuttals. In addition to that, the 2NC generally takes what's considered a big stick option, meaning this is a negative position. They read pretty much every debate. So they are an expert on it. And it's very easy and quick for them to prep. If there's an argument that only applies to this AF, is super complicated, you've opened it up 15 minutes for the debate and you're just figuring it out, is that a good thing for the 2NC to go for? No, because you're going to spend all your time figuring it out and not knowing what's going on. Here's where the 1NR comes in. The 1NR needs to be the best speech in the debate. The reason why is they have the most prep. So that 2NC, AF goes, they get 3 minutes across free prep. Then they get to use prep time. They might use 2 minutes. That's a total of 5 minutes. Does everyone see that? To prepare their 8-minute speech. Not much time. Vice versa, the 1NR, they had that 3 minutes of cross where, yes, they had to participate, but they got to kind of work on some of their card comparisons during cross. Then they got the free prep their partner took. So their partner, say, took 3 minutes. Then, while their partner's giving an 8-minute speech, they got free prep. So 3 plus 8 is 11. Then there's the 3-minute cross of the 2NC after that. Now we're up to 14. And then the 1NR goes. So should the 1NR ever be taking their own prep? No. It's a big, you get laughed at if you do. You've already had 14 minutes. Any more prep you take is basically you taking a knife and stabbing your partner. And so you want to make sure that you are prepping super well, not taking prep, making sure you're ready to go when your partner's cross-ex is over. Things to help out, because you have so much prep, you get to make more card comparisons. You get to read all their evidence, indict it, Google it, look up their author, find out indicts of it. There's no cross-ex of you, so they don't get to sort of indict you or question you afterwards. And so you'll usually take something like politics DA, or you'll take a topicality argument, or something like that. On case specifically. So your goal on case is to decrease the probability of the affirmative advantage to near 0. To do that, you have to decisively win at least one argument on the flow. It's better to take one argument on the flow, knock it out of the park, and get the AF down to 0, than extend 5 arguments, and each are maybe only a 10% answer. and then your opponent answers it, and it's back up to 100. And so the basic order of operations for a 2NC. So we're on case. It's the same thing on each one. They've done their card comparison on each one. I'm going to identify what I want to go for. Let's say I'm going for number 2. First thing I'm going to do is read my argument extension of number 2. So all these things we're writing for individual cards, here's where they come out. You take that extension to the case argument that you wrote out, you read it. Extend Johnson 99, there's no impact to Russia war because blank, blank, blank. After you've read the argument extension, then you need to kind of both frontline their responses. So they say this, but, they say this, but, plus add your own card comparison. So for example, your opponent might be like, your Johnson evidence is bad because it's old. It's 2021. And so first you would say extend Johnson, no impact to Russia war because ABC. They say Johnson is old, but all the things it cites are still relevant today, poor economy, Ukraine, etc. 2, even if it's old, it is super qualified national security expert. The affirmatives evidence that says there is an impact to Russia war comes from yahoo.com. Even if it's from 2 weeks ago, it's ridiculous. Should not give it any credibility. You see how I've not only answered their card comparison, I made my own? And then only after you've done this essential card comparison spot do you read additional cards. And the additional cards need to add something new. So if I read Frank 92 and it says the exact same warrants as Johnson, have I added anything in the debate? No, because their original responses still apply. However, I read Frank 25, it might have the same warrants, but now it's a newer card. And they said their original card comparison was your evidence is too old, but guess what? Frank ain't old, Frank's new, and so we're good. Or vice versa, even if Frank might add an extra warrant, Frank might also be old, but the first one has A, B, and C. They've indicted A, B, and C. Here's warrant D. And warrant D is new and good and beats them. And so you read additional evidence if it adds to your argument. If it adds 0 and just repeats in the same words, you are wasting your own time. The 1AR is always going to get to use their 1AC. So even if they really didn't talk about, their Johnson, their Frank 1AC evidence, in the 1AR they can be like, look, we had an impact card. Here's their warrants and how it answers it. And so even if they didn't tell you what the ask card is to respond, if you're neg, it's your job, you got their case 30 minutes in advance, to go through and find out where it clashes and to make that card comparison yourself and not be like, they never told me Frank. And then in the 1AR, they extend Frank and said, learn how to read the 1AC. And then in the 2NR, you're making brand new card comparison. You need to be making that early, and that requires you to know the AF, and it's your burden to think about how your neg card takes out the AF. Time management. So you need to think about how important case is to you winning the debate. If your strategy to win the debate doesn't rely on case, you're going for, say, topicality, you're saying they have cheated, you don't really have to beat case, so going for case isn't very helpful. If your argument is something that requires you to outweigh case because you have a DA and you have to outweigh case, then case is a lot more important. In your rounds for NDCA packet, there's going to be an emphasis on your judges to have more case debating than average in varsity. And so you're probably going to be spending more than that 1 or 2 minutes. You're probably closer to 3 or 4 in the negative block on case. Because you know their case, you're expected to be able to beat it. And so that is the time you're spent on these case arguments, which means you're probably not just extending one argument. You might be expending 2 or 3 of the 5, and then reading more cards for each. That is how you pressure the 1AR. Last slide. Common mistakes. It is very common for JV students and low-level varsity debaters to think, ooh, horizontal proliferation good. I'm going to just do an argument extension to each one. I'm not going to make any card comparisons, and I am just going to read argument extension. Here's 5 more cards. Haha, pressured the 1AR. Next one, argument extension. Here's 5 cards. But if you made 0 card comparison, it's very easy for the AF, if they did card comparison, to get up and say, you have dropped this card comparison. It takes out your original card, and maybe 3 of the 5 cards you read. And now I just have to answer these 2. And so doing card comparison is usually far more important and scary for the 1AR to deal with than just adding extra cards. In fact, it's almost better to have no cards, know your evidence really well, have lots of in-depth card comparisons, than it is to have 0 card comparison, lots of cards. Both is best, but if you have to choose, card comparison first. Don't drop advantages. We all learned this from PF. You spend all your time on advantage 1, never get to advantage 2, what's your opponent going for? Advantage 2, and you lost very quickly. And so you got to manage your time, think about, can I just extend 1? You might think, oh, I can get to 2. You look at the clock, crap, 45 seconds left. Maybe I'm scratching this one. And then saying, okay, go to the next page. I'll just extend my number 3 here to make sure I have something on each thing. You have the 1R as help. So you're usually expected, the 2N, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Has anyone ever heard that before? Okay, concept that says, you're hungrier than you actually are. Same thing, 2NC thinks, oh, I'm Superman, Superwoman. I'm going to cover everything. And in reality, you don't. Timer goes off, you're like, crap, I've missed 2 arguments. You just give up and say that sheet's dead? No. Your partner, the 1R, usually reserves about 30 seconds to 1 minute of their speech to finish you, to help cover things you missed. And so usually you'll say, hey partner, I didn't read this one block on the last one. Can you just read this? And they'll say, I gotcha. And at the beginning, they can finish the partner's speech, read it, then transition to their own stuff. Last big thing is, don't just go fast. Very common when you were young. You see debaters who are like, ooh, I watched this one person on YouTube and I'm going to copy them, and it's case debate, and it basically sounds the whole time. Is that flowable? No. Is it something that is the judge is going to be flowing? No. So do you really have to answer it? Nope. You can just group it and be like, I couldn't flow it, you couldn't flow it, let's move on. Now, if the judge is flowing it and you're not, and because they're going, they can't understand them going too fast, then you got to kind of do more drills yourself to get on top of the level the judge is. But when you're young, it is very common for debaters to sacrifice clarity for speed. And at least if there's a card, if you're slow on the tag and somewhat unclear in the card, could I at least still flow the tag and know what's going on? Yeah, that's usually okay for novices. They'll accept that. But if you are completely unclear, they ain't flowing it, they're not going to give you any leeway. On case, there's not many cards. It's a lot of analytics and card comparisons, which means if you were just blippily going something that you've written, and what ends up happening is these first few debates, since they're all the same, a lot of you are going to type out basically an entire speech. And it's going to be super clear and great, and you're going to think, ooh, I can go fast, and you're going to go so fast on analytics, no one can flow it, and you're just mumbling through it, and you wonder why you lost, even though you've solved the math equation. And so going slow is far, far better on case or whenever you have an analytic. Slow down, and then when it gets to the card, you can speed up. Cool. So that is our lecture.